Good morning and happy Thursday. I'm Toby Tompkins, the CEO of Safio, and welcome to Ask Toby. Hope you've had a good week. A very interesting conversation and question that happened this week that I want to unpack a little bit today, which is the question of what's more important to manage as a leader or as an individual in a workplace where you are not a member of the majority. Should you manage your identity, or are you more challenged by your identity, or are you more challenged by your image? It's a very interesting question. So I spent a lot of time, I actually wrote a book a number of years ago called The Real Lives of Strong Black Women. And in that book, I interviewed 150 Black women in the US, the Caribbean, and the UK about what it meant to be strong, Black, and a woman. And I did a similar conversation with Black men. And one of the things that emerged was the concept of managing the gap between identity, the me I know myself to be, and image, the me the world projects upon me, or the me I must project upon to the world in order to be in the world. And so the issue of image and identity are like two guardrails that individuals, and most particularly leaders, need to manage very precisely and with a lot of effectiveness in order to be able to be a part of a world that was not built with them necessarily in mind. I'll never forget when I started early in my career, I worked with a large transportation company in the US. And this was 35 years ago. And I was interviewing one of the first female executives in the executive suite of this building. This building was an old building that had been around since the corporate headquarters had been around since the early days of this large major transportation company. And there was construction going on in her office. And I said, "Oh, what's what are you redecorating?" She says, "Well, we're installing a bathroom in my office." And I thought, wow, what a nice thing to do. Like, what executive gets his or her own private bathroom? And the executive said, "Well, I'm the first executive woman at this level of the organization, and as a result, there are no bathrooms. When this building was designed, there were no women's bathrooms on the floor of the executive offices. There was just no intention for that design. There was never seen a reason for a woman's bathroom to be necessary on the executive level. And so now that they had a female executive, they needed to address in an appropriate way the question of, well, where is she going to use the bathroom without having to leave the executive level and go to another floor, which is what the receptionists used to do all the time. And so my next question was, well, how does that make you feel? And she was torn. I could see her negotiating in her thinking of a response. The image that she wanted to portray as a member of the executive team and as a leader and as someone who's in a conversation with me at that time, a diversity consultant, and who she really knew herself to be. And on the one hand, she was pissed. She thought it was ridiculous that you could build a building and not take into consideration the fact that she, as a talented and competent and high-performing executive, could ever need to use the bathroom on the executive suite of that floor. And yet, as an executive, she needed to not express any of the consequence of that design or of that reality, and yet still make sure that the organization did the right thing. That tension that she managed is the same tension that people of color or LGBTQI people and in many cases, increasingly now that we're in more diverse environments, white men have to manage every single day between, well, gee, I know diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, but I don't need it. I'm a nice guy. That's my image. I don't have a problem with this. That's my image. That's my identity as well. And so how you manage this identity versus image tension that every leader must deal with. One is by letting the world know what you see, not necessarily in the form of a criticism, but in the form of a question. So being able to say, as an executive, well, gee, where did women use the bathroom before I arrived on this executive level? So making the obvious evident as opposed to just the obvious silent, and inviting a conversation without blame about why this change needs to happen. That's something that leaders need to do, right? Is to make the obvious evidence. The other is to understand the ways in which your identity and your image, the things that you put into the world in order to be successful or to survive, are different. And being very public about that, which is part of the role of LGBTQ people in their decisions to be out and engaged in the workplace. It's a very powerful resource to be able to hide your identity and only focus on your image. But even that comes at a great cost. And then there is the issue of defending and advocating for your identity, regardless of the image that the organization expects you to portray. And so we see that in challenges like dress code and women's hair. You know, African-American women, for example, are often challenged with their ability or desire to wear natural hair, which is a part of who they are and their hair. And that's their identity. It's something that it speaks to who they are, but that must be modified in the workplace context. So this issue between image and identity are huge issues. We don't spend a lot of time talking about them. And the reason that tension is so important is because our implicit biases, both favorably and negatively, live around the image and the identities that we must manage in the workplace. I'm a big, dark-skinned man. That's who I am. That is my identity. And to this day in 2021, it's my image of, am I safe or not safe when the elevator door opens, right? Do I smile? Do I say hello? Do I create proper distance inside of the elevator if I'm on there with only one other person who's typically white or female? Those are all of the things that I must do that someone else might not have to do to manage the anxiety, the social anxiety between my identity and my image. So I want you to think about, what are some of the things that people in your organization or on your team must do to manage this gap? I want you to have a conversation with your direct reports about that. Okay. And then before you do that, I want you to identify at least 2 ways in which your identity and your image serve as an opportunity for you through the way you manage it, and in what ways might it serve as a challenge. Hopefully that's helpful to the person who asked the question. If you want to discuss this more, feel free to send me an email at asktoby@safio.com. Have a great week or a great weekend. We'll talk to you next week.